Um, I guess we'll start off as people are coming in. We'll just keep going because we have so many wonderful events today. So we don't want to cut anyone short, and we have so much great stuff to talk about. So just a very brief word of welcome and some housekeeping from me. My name is Dr. Caroline Schroeder. I'm here in Ireland, and I'm one of the organizers of Douglass Week. And I just wanted to say how delighted we are to welcome you and to celebrate Douglass Week with all of you. And, you know, we're especially looking forward to today to this talk because we want to talk about all the many very contemporary issues and topics that come up when we talk about Frederick Douglass. And before we do that, and before I hand over to the wonderful Kristen Leary, I just wanted to give you some few small bits of housekeeping. One is that it's going to take about 1 hour 15. This event's going to be about 1 hour 15. And if you have questions, so the people in the audience who have questions, you see the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen, and you could pop in a question there. And us here as the hosts of Douglass Week, we will monitor that very closely and we'll pass on the questions to the speakers. And just to note that the event is being recorded and we're also live on YouTube. So hello to all our YouTube followers as well. And yeah, I hope you enjoy this event. I hope you are enjoying Douglass Week. And now I'll hand over to the wonderful Kristen Leary, who will guide us through this conversation and through this event. She's an advisor at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. She's also one of the brilliant co-organizers of Douglass Week, and she's a great colleague and a wonderful friend. So Kristen, stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks especially to our panelists. And because we have quite a program, I won't talk for very long before introducing our co-hosts really with me for the evening's talk, Ashlie Bryant and Ken Morris, who will in turn introduce the rest of our panel conversationalists. But I just want to say how excited we are that we were able to hold this forum and talk about the Protect anti-trafficking program. It's an important part of continuing Frederick Douglass's legacy today. And we're really delighted that all of you can join us here online. So without further ado, I'll introduce you first to Ashlie Bryant. Ashlie founded Three Strands Global Foundation in 2010. And over the past 10 years, she's led the development of Protect, which, as I mentioned, is a global anti-trafficking training curriculum, now live in 4 states and several countries. And we'll talk about perhaps bringing that to Ireland and Northern Ireland as we go forward as well. But to date, the program has reached over 60,000 adults and more than 500,000 young people throughout the United States. Ashlie also has expanded Three Strands programming to include a direct services program called Employ and Empower, which hopefully we'll hear more about today as well. But that program has placed over 300 survivors and at-risk youth in sustainable jobs in the last 4 years, which is also very exciting and important work. And speaking of which, Ashlie was instrumental in the passage of anti-human trafficking legislation in California, the Human Trafficking Prevention Education Act, which is the first legislation of its kind in the United States. And hopefully that will be duplicated throughout the United States and perhaps even more comprehensively on the federal level here. As I mentioned, Ashlie will lead us in conversation today with Ken Morris, Kenneth B. Morris, Jr., who is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington, and also the co-founder of the Protect program with Ashlie and Three Strands. And Ken, as you might imagine, continues his family's legacy through being the president and co-founder of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, which is based in Rochester, New York, recently based in Rochester, New York, which we're very excited about. And Ken is also a board member of the Frederick Douglass Ireland Project, and strongly believes, as Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington did, that education is the pathway to freedom. So I think that's a perfect segue to throw to you, Ashlie, to introduce our other 2 panelists who work to empower and uplift students and young people every day. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Kristen, so much. Thank you for having us here today. And thank you, Ken, for continuing Frederick Douglass's legacy the way that you do every single day. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce to you two wonderful people on the panel. The first is Terry Clark. Terry Clark actually is coming to us today from San Diego, California, where she is a teacher and advocate for children and has been for the last 25 years. She not only is a protect champion in the schools, but she has the eyes and ears that really seek out to understand her students in the classroom. And in addition to that, to be able to train and help come alongside colleagues, as sometimes human trafficking and the discussion of human trafficking can be overwhelming. And so she is that positive force, not only at her school, but in her district and in the county of San Diego. And we are incredibly thankful and grateful for her championship of the Protect program at her high school and beyond. So welcome, Terry, to the panel today. Our next panelist is Megan Blanchfield, who is a recent graduate of NYU Nursing School. She is a nurse who began her advocacy back in high school when she herself was a student being trained on what was human trafficking, and it was a new concept at the time for her. And so she not only has continued her advocacy, but also is in her nursing profession, helping her other colleagues look and see what might be happening around them as it relates to vulnerable populations. So she is on our panel today as not only a student, but also an advocate as well. And so we're just grateful to be able to have this time with all of you and looking forward to your questions as we go through this panel as well.
Thank you very much, Ashlie. It's great to be with everybody today. And thank you for the introductions, Kristen and Caroline. You know, as you heard, I am the great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and I'm also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington, founder and educator of Tuskegee Institute in Normal School, now Tuskegee University in Alabama. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection to Douglass and Washington is. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent, and some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, she lived to be 95, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass's lap, as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when we first started our work at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007, I remember being with a group of students, and they were looking at me cross-eyed like, man, you are so far removed, and what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? And so I wanted to give them some context to help them wrap their minds around the distance between the generations. And I had this thought that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man, I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country. Now, I had spent most of my life really running away from this incredible lineage that I carry for many reasons. But in 2005, I read a National Geographic magazine cover story, and the headline was 21st Century Slaves. And it was about human trafficking and modern day slavery existing today in every country around the world, including right here in the United States and including in Ireland. And I was shocked by that headline, and I wanted to learn more. So I started researching and reading as many articles as I could get my hands on. And I remember reading a story about a 12-year-old girl that was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. And at the time, my daughters were 12 and 9 years old. And there was one evening when I was contemplating and thinking about this young 12-year-old girl. And down the hallway, I could hear my girls getting ready for bed. And they were laughing and playing and about to get down on their knees to say their prayers. And my mind just starts racing, and I'm thinking that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed and not being servicing some sick individual and being forced into bed. And when I went in to say goodnight to my daughters, I had this moment where I couldn't look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was almost immediately that I started to think about Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist and Booker T. Washington as the great educator. How can we work on anti-trafficking issues? Abolition through education. We could work to provide prevention education to reduce the vulnerability of young people to being trafficked for sex and for labor. And so we started our organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, in 2007. We immediately turned to schools, and we just started going in and talking to students about the history of slavery in this country. We would talk about human rights issues and human trafficking. And as we would go from school to school talking about this, we had teachers and students start to ask us, well, what can we do to become modern day abolitionists like Frederick Douglass? How can we communicate the inhumanity of slavery to our communities? And so our work is built on the foundation of one story in Frederick Douglass's life, which I'll share with you quickly. And that is, he had been born into slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man. It was presumed that his enslaver was his father. At the age of around 8 or 9 years old, he was chosen from among all of the children on that plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's family. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that could help him learn to read and write, because as we know from our US history, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. But now he was going to be in Baltimore. He was going to be in the big city. He would be around free Black children, and he would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got there was his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before, and she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. She was just a kind woman who was teaching her young son, and there was Frederick, just really eager to learn and wide-eyed, and she just naturally turned to him and began to teach him his ABCs. Well, that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental darkness. And the lessons continued for a little while until his enslaver found out about him, and he got angry when he found out, and he looked at his wife and he looked at young Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." And Frederick heard that message loud and clear, and he looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, which is a message that we hear today, and education equals freedom, education equals emancipation, education equals liberation. And he would teach himself to read and write. Now, I don't have time to go through his whole story, but I will say that at the age of 20, on September 3rd, 1838, with the help of my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass, he would escape from slavery. He would eventually start to speak out as one of the first survivors of slavery that could communicate the inhumanity of slavery from a firsthand account. So his voice became very important. And then the other thing, when we went into schools to start talking about this very prickly subject of human trafficking, wrapping it within the context of history tended to soften some of those really rough edges. And so that's how we were able to really bring this education initially into schools. The program eventually evolved into a program that we called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. And then in 2011, Mayor Bloomberg's office in New York City asked us to come in to do a prevention education program, which then evolved into our Protect program, which you're going to hear about this evening. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ashlie, and she can talk about this human trafficking prevention education program that we're very proud of and that is impacting the lives of many teachers, educators, and students. So Ashlie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, so much. And I shared with Ken that I'm actually listening to the Frederick Douglass narrative, which has just been incredibly powerful to have read it and now to hear it on Audible. It just reminds me why we do the work we do, and what a just amazing man he was for so many reasons. So I thought for our folks today who are listening that what we do is we'll actually share a little bit of foundation. As we were talking about human trafficking, we thought it'd be helpful to define the issue. So we're going to do that first, and then Ken and I and Megan and Terry will go into the Protect program so that you can better understand what we're doing across the United States as well as globally. So from a foundation, when we talk about human trafficking, the U.S. Department of State and the United Nations, they define it the same way, which is that human trafficking is modern day slavery, and it's an umbrella term for both commercial sexual exploitation, which we call sex trafficking, and forced labor, which we call labor trafficking. And there are three words that are really important for us to be able to identify as in the definition of human trafficking, and that is force, fraud, and coercion. And the reason why force, fraud, and coercion are so important is because that really helps us discern what is human trafficking and what isn't human trafficking. So human trafficking is not human smuggling, for example. Human trafficking is not kidnapping, right? Those are different. Force, fraud, and coercion help us to be able to identify what is human trafficking and what is not. So the force is physical harm, the fraud is deception and financial gain, and coercion is persuading someone to do something by force or threats. And coercion is usually the hardest to be able to prove because that is where someone is being sly or tricky, and coercion is difficult sometimes to help our students to understand, but it is a really important piece for all of us because what we like to be able to point out is that in nearly a third of cases, especially sex trafficking cases, defendants didn't control their victims by force, but rather by fraud or coercion. There are many myths around human trafficking, and it's important for us to understand the story behind human trafficking because this is not a take and grab crime. This is really a crime that happens over time, and grooming actually happens with the trafficker and the victim. And so when we talk about sex trafficking, we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation. We're talking about using force, fraud, and coercion to actually engage in commercial sex for victims against their will. And then for labor trafficking, as I shared that umbrella term, and we're really talking about forcing individuals against their will to work, they're either in debt bondage or child labor or forced labor. So those are the two that we focus in on at the UN level, as well as in the United States, the National Trafficking Hotline. So this is a global issue. There are 40 million victims of modern day slavery globally. And we know in the US that there's at least 100,000 girls and boys that are exploited in the United States daily. I thought that we would grab this just to give just for you all, as you're in Ireland, you can have an understanding. In the US, we do track how many incidents, and federally we had 606 cases last year, which doesn't seem like a lot, but I'll tell you why, and this is why this global issue is important to be able to discuss. This crime hides in plain sight. So even though we may not see actually in that map everything being red or yellow, doesn't mean that human trafficking isn't happening there. It means that we need to be able to have eyes to see. We need to be trained and educated, which really leads us into the 4 Ps as it relates to human trafficking that we need to focus in on globally. And that is, there's prosecution, there's protection, there's partnerships, and there's prevention. And the reason why those 4 Ps are so important is we need a map or a guide in order to be able to guide us in this place, to be able to say, how do we actually combat this crime? We with the Protect program would say that prevention is going upstream, preventing the crime before it starts. Prosecution is after something has happened, maybe making sure we hold accountable those who have trafficked victims. And then partnerships are making sure that both public as well as private, that we have partnerships to have resources for our victims as well as prevention resources. And then the protection component is really about residential care. How do we make sure we have enough beds and resources to actually make sure that survivors are not only healed, but are thriving and free as they walk into their lives going forward? So we thought that that would be a really important sort of baseline. And then this is our last piece that we thought would be good to share with you as a foundation. that I talked about 100,000 girls and boys. And this is just those stats that tell us 81% are trapped in forced labor, 75% are female, and 25% of those are children. So important for us to be able to recognize that and understand it as we look at statistics and talk about this crime of human trafficking. So now I thought what I'll do is I'll stop share for a second. And if you have any questions, please make sure that you ask those. But I thought Ken and I would just take a moment to be able to share with you what he was talking about, where he left off on the story of how Protect began. And if it's okay, Ken, I'll talk about my lunch with the supervising deputy attorney general in California, and then how we connected. So in 2010 is when Three Strands Global Foundation was founded. And when we were doing very similar work to the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in schools, really focusing in on how do we prevent this from happening. And then in 2014, late, I was having lunch with the then deputy supervising attorney general, Maggie Krell, and she asked if we could really come together with other nonprofits to systematically scale a program throughout the state of California. So that was her request. And being someone who is working in the schools, and we had volunteers up and down the state of California teaching in 9th grade classrooms, I thought we'd have to clone a lot of people to be able to actually scale a program like that she was asking us to do. But what I did instead was I really looked through programs in the United States that I felt were on par with what we were seeing in the classroom in California, and had not only the integrity, but also had the vision of scaling things systematically. And Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives was one of those nonprofits, as well as another nonprofit called Love Never Fails. So together, the three of us, along with the AG in California and the Department of Education in California, sat down to create what we now know as the Protect program. So that is prevention organized to educate children on trafficking.
As I mentioned, we were in New York City doing some work for Mayor Bloomberg's office. And what we decided that we were going to do was bring in experts to do the training. And so we would do in-person training of educators, but we found that in order to be able to reach as many teachers and students as possible, we would need to scale up the program, because, and Ashlie said to me early on that, you know what, Ken, it'll be our great-grandchildren that are still teaching this if we do this on an in-person basis. So I had met a board member for Ashley's organization, and we had talked for a couple of years about something that we could do together, and we didn't know exactly what that was going to be. And then eventually he introduced me to Ashlie. We had a conversation, which we really hit it off and thought that there's a lot of synergy here and we could do some great work together. And then we started to work just to put all of this together. I brought in our co-founder, Robert Benz, and he really took the lead on our end of things. And then just really excited that this program came together in the way that it has. And with Ashlie leading it, it has really taken off. As you heard in her introduction, we're in counties throughout California, we're in Texas, we're in Utah, we're starting in Michigan, we're in the Republic of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea. And so this idea of scaling this up so that we could reach as many educators as possible, who in turn can teach this curricula in the classroom. This is how we're going to be able to reduce the vulnerability of children to being trafficked for sex and for labor. This is the most comprehensive, innovative human trafficking prevention education program out there. You know, when we started to think about how we can have an impact on this issue, we looked at the landscape, and it was really driven by the legislation in the United States, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was first enacted in 2000, and then it's reauthorized every 4 years. And what we found that it was a victim-centered approach, which we argue that it should be a victim-centered approach, and we actually need more resources, but we weren't really doing anything to prevent the victimization in the first place. So as well-meaning as all of the organizations that were doing this great work, we were creating this cycle of exploitation where we're just rescuing, restoring, and rehabilitating without preventing new victims from being spewed into that cycle. And this is what prevention education does. It reduces the vulnerability of young people to being trafficked, but it stops eventually that cycle from continuing on.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. So I think I'll share my screen again, and that way we can go through what is the PROTECT program. So, and this is where Terry and Megan will also jump in and be able to be great advocates and information for you all who are watching to understand from the teacher and the student perspective, what does this actually look like and feel like in the classroom. So when we talk about PROTECT, Ken talked about that there are three of us, three nonprofits that founded this: Three Strands Global Foundation, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, and Love Never Fails. Really, it's a four-pronged approach, and it is very unique in that we did look at the landscape, and we wanted to make sure that we took our intellectual property that we had, each of us as nonprofits, but also the knowledge of working with survivor leaders and also interviewing traffickers and buyers, and put that into the PROTECT program so that ultimately we would do really effective holistic prevention. So it looks like four prongs. First is a protocol, making sure there is a protocol established so that we can get resources to our children if they need them, that all staff on a campus is trained, that education happens from the age of 6 or 5 years old all the way to 18 years old, and that there's research. Impact is incredibly important. We need to make sure that we are having an evaluation plan and a logic model, which we established to make sure that we are actually doing the good work that we have set out to do. When I talk about a protocol, this is just an example of a diagram of making sure that our protocol is known by all who is on a campus, so that teachers who are trained can be able to identify students who are educated can self-identify and report to someone they trust, and then someone that they trust can get the resources to them that they need so that we have the outcomes that we need in a coordinated way. The other piece that makes our PROTECT program and our value proposition of this program incredibly unique is that we have a partnership with Arizona State University. We've worked with their behavioral scientists, their gaming, innovation, and education department to put together a growth platform. So what that means is it's not just checking a box. It's not just a learning management system. It is really helping our teachers and our educational staff and our law enforcement and our social services understand what human trafficking is and what it's not, but more importantly, what they can do, what they can see, and how they might actually connect with others in their community with stories, qualitative stories, as they are continuing their education and then going into actually to teach the students. So we actually have, they connect with each other, they grow with each other, and then they apply their knowledge. So now we're going to talk about the actual training. There's three components to the training. We have a human trafficking overview and exploitation overview, really diving deep into what is exploitation, both from a sex trafficking, labor trafficking perspective. What is trauma and what is vulnerability? And what is important to be able to identify, and then referring back to in 103 the protocol and red flags, so that teachers feel empowered to be able to refer to that protocol and empowered to actually teach the curriculum. And this is the journey to protect with the training. So I'm going to pause there for a minute and let Terry come in and speak to, as a teacher, what does this really mean? And for her and her colleagues, what is it that she has experienced with the PROTECT program?
Hello, Ireland, and it's just a privilege to be here, and a special little hello to any educators out there. Thank you for tuning in and wanting to be present in the midst of a tough subject, and it's a tough subject to bring to students of any age, particularly high schoolers. I think that as a teacher, I started down the path of just educating myself. I happened to have a family member who had been trafficked, and I think it just, it broke my heart into a million pieces. And I thought, how can I help this from happening to anybody else? And so through searching and learning about different things, and Three Strands Global, I found this amazing curriculum. My district is in line with it. They advocate for it. It's the curriculum they recommend. As a teacher, what I love is that is very articulated. So it starts developmentally where a student is at. If they're in 5 years old, all the way up to 9th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, that it is developmentally appropriate, and it targets where they're at. It targets the things that they're about, the things that they're vulnerable to, the things that they're subjective to, and it educates them. And I get to just come right alongside these students in their learning process, in their awareness. You can see the lights coming on, you can see, in their faces, you can see the knowledge going in, and then the conversations that come afterwards really are part of how I know the students have caught the curriculum that I've taught.
Yeah, thank you, Terry, so much. I really appreciate that. And I think that it's really important what you're saying about that light bulb aha, right? That those moments where students, where you as a teacher, and this is, Ken, what we talked about so early on, was we wanted the teachers to be teaching these students. We had done, as nonprofits, done that for years, both Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives as well as Three Strands, but you see them day in and day out. You know them, you are that trusted adult for them. And I think that's incredibly powerful in the Protect program, is that we really rely on you, those advocates, to do this work. And so I want to just go for a second, and Megan, you feel free to jump into, and Terry in this place. So some of the things that Terry talked about that we go over are risk factors and protective factors, right? What makes a child vulnerable? And these on the right-hand side, you can see are some of the things that make them vulnerable. What are those risk factors that make them, vulnerable to trafficking as well, or exploitation? And online, especially in the pandemic and the COVID, where we're looking at students who are online, how can we help our teachers identify these things so that as they teach through distance learning, they can still be able to see something that might be at risk? And then red flags, both for sex trafficking as well as for labor trafficking. Again, empowering our staff, what are the red flags so that they can feel confident as they look into their classrooms, but also look into those children's eyes and be able to teach them, what are those red flags to be able to help them identify someone who may be at risk. And then this next two, Terry, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say, as a teacher, you have your max number of students. So I'm a physical education teacher. I will see over 200 students in a day. And sometimes I think, how can I see every student and try to catch the red flags, the warnings? But once you educate all 200 students, they're all looking out for each other now. They know the signs. They come to me. They say, I see this in a student. I heard this conversation. And you have more than, 100-fold your efforts.
That's such great. Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that. And some of the things that we talked about as the Protect program has grown over the years, because we've been rolling this out, as Ken said, in California, Texas, Utah, Michigan, now Georgia, and soon Ohio, and then the Republic of Cyprus, and as Australia is now reviewing this as well. So we are incredibly humbled and honored about that, but important for us to have the conversation around equity and inclusion and diversity, anti-racism, right? All things that Frederick Douglass, in who he was, emulated all the time. What does it mean to protect our rights? How can we as advocates make sure students understand and not only protect their rights, but Terry, to your point, protect the rights of others as well? And we've come alongside in our curriculum to make sure that this happens to a great degree. I'm going to go now and actually turn to Megan, because I think, Megan, you can really speak to not only the equity and the diversity and inclusion, but also the protecting your rights. And as a student who was 14 years old, hearing this for the first time in your classroom, help us understand sort of the journey to protect that you've been on and what that has looked for you.
Absolutely. So I was educated by Protect in 9th grade. So, and not only did it teach me about the risk factors of trafficking, online safety, and the hotline to call if I sensed something was off in my community or at school, it definitely protected me and my friends and helped me become the advocate that I am today. I think first and foremost, it helped me to start to recognize situations that just didn't feel right in my gut. And I started to do this quicker than my peers would, and especially on social media, which was so important, is so important for my generation. And it kind of took me even through college. Once I hit college, there were certain situations. I can think of one with social media where it was actually on Snapchat, and traffickers were getting tricky, and they were using Snapchat locations that they had friended people and actually following them and tracking them down and then coercing them into trafficking. And I actually received a couple of these fishy account requests, and my friends did as well. And I knew to immediately block them and say, oh, absolutely block these accounts. These are not safe accounts, but not everybody knows that. They didn't have the education that I was so lucky to have at such a young age, that, you know, protected me in high school, then protected me in college, and now is even as an adult living in a big city like New York. So yeah, it definitely, and now even in nursing, so in terms of nursing, we're encountering different people every single day. And in the ER is one of the most accessible places to really identify victims and help people. And so in nursing school, I chose to focus a lot of the projects that I was doing on anti-human trafficking, early identification of victims in the medical field, to start to kind of raise awareness in our curriculum, because I think we had maybe just one day of one class that trafficking was brought up. So one of the statistics that really stuck out to me in one of these projects that I did was that 88% of human trafficking victims have actually had contact with a medical professional at some time while they were a victim, and but they were not recognized by these medical providers. And so I was just like, oh my goodness. And so hearing stats like this, I was like, we need to do something. I need to, you know, educate my fellow nursing friends and classmates. And I had Ashlie come and speak to my women's health club. And so yes, Protect has just guided me through my life and over the last almost like 10 years now. So I'm very, very, very grateful.
Yeah, and I love what you say, Megan, that you have along this journey, you have continued to be an advocate. And I love your Snapchat example too. I mean, Terry, you must in the classroom see that all the time, but that one of the concepts, Ken, that we did early on was the inner voice, right? That's woven through all of our modules from the elementary school, which is 5 years old, all the way to 18. And that's what Megan's talking about, right? She's talking about that she realized what that was early on. And then when it came years later that she needed to listen to it, she was attuned to it because she understood and practiced it. Terry, I'd love for you to share with us some of the students, you know, that you can, you know, in that space that where Megan was sharing that have been, you know, on Snapchat or other social media platforms that you might know about.
Yes, so Snapchat is a big one with high school students, the TikTok format, and now with even like I think Instagram with their reels of just anywhere that a teenager's eyes and ears tend to wander, teaching our population that unless you know the signs, unless you know the warnings, you are vulnerable. You're part of the vulnerable population. And so just stressing to them, that is why we are covering, you know, human trafficking in a school setting. That's why we're covering it in a physical education class or your history class, that if you don't know and you are not educated about it, you are part of the vulnerable population. And you have got to know that they are working 24/7 to get access to you. That's one of the things that I just try to really, you know, implore to my students is somebody is working 24/7 to try to get access to you.
Yeah, and especially during this pandemic and COVID, if you guys can share with us, both of you, because as a student, Megan, as well as a teacher, and I know from our side, you know, we've met teachers where they're at with this program, right? And so as soon as the pandemic hit, we had curriculum that was, Terry, you know, in the classroom, and we had to pivot and create all new distance learning curriculum because of the pandemic. And one of my friends yesterday said, the struggle creates diamonds. I thought that was a great expression, right? The struggle of having to pivot and create distance learning curriculum actually created this beautiful piece for Protect to actually reach students in a different way and arm you all in with what you needed as teachers. And so if you could speak to that a little bit, that would be great. And then Megan, if you'll just speak to what it means to be a distance learning student, right?
Yes.
That would be great.
Yes. So when we first went distance learning, I really struggled knowing that this was a content that really needed to be taught, but I struggled with so many kids home alone and maybe some trapped. And so after talking through with some advocates and at the administration level, and deciding that this was definitely something that needed to be brought to the students during this time, and to give them tools if they were in a vulnerable situation, if they were being exploited, if they were being trafficked, that they would have the tools, the knowledge, and the information, even while being confined inside, of their home. One of the things that I have really loved about the curriculum is it's not just about teaching them the warning signs and symptoms and red flags, is that it also looks at how subtly it creeps into their lives. And it really helps them become wise consumers in so many ways of what they're consuming through their social media, what they're consuming through their other friends' exposing them to certain things. In the classroom in-person curriculum that I have also taught, I love that it addresses pornography because we talk about marijuana as a gateway drug for teenagers. Pornography is the gateway drug for human trafficking. And so it's so multifaceted in how it comes at the student and really tries to kind of infiltrate and integrate the curriculum, all of how they learn and all of what they are exposed to.
Absolutely. And I did basically half of my nursing program online due to COVID. And I think, I'm a young adult, and I think that there's going to the classroom and being in person is a completely different experience. And you also get to see your friends, and you're recognized by your teachers and by the people around you. And being online for school, students are just home all day long. There's a lot more time to spend on your phone. There's a lot more time to be bored and, get into different types of trouble. And I think too, it's very isolating. A lot of students, especially for high school students and middle school students, seeing your friends is everything. It's so important. You don't want to see your family, you want to see your friends. And I think, that isolation experience definitely contributes to the already awful mental health epidemic that we're dealing with. But I think that's going to turn students to their phones and to social media and to make friends online. And then as a young adult, even online dating, that's been something that I've even had to educate my friends about, because now you can't go on a date in person, you're online dating. And what does that mean? I think there's even more risk factors with that than meeting someone in person. So yeah, there's so many.
That's a great point, Megan. But I love the fact that, one of the things as we think about teaching students at a young age, and then all the way till 18 and beyond, that you're taking those things that you have learned early on and through this curriculum, and then you're using that in your life as a young adult, as a young woman, and then advocating too as a nurse on behalf of others. And Terry, you're so right to be able to see students use this curriculum knowing that there would be higher vulnerability is incredibly valuable. And I think, if I go, sort of think back for our listeners to the four-pronged approach, right? Protocols are in place. The Protect program has the ability to design protocols to make sure that our students are safe, and our educator staff can make sure they have access to that. There's training, there's curriculum, and then there's the research. And this is the piece that I'll actually go to next, which is what is the research showing us, right? So we actually track what we call our theory of change. Have we increased awareness and knowledge about human trafficking across the board with our teachers and our students? Have we increased not only the knowledge of human trafficking, but the signs and the tactics of traffickers, and what is vulnerability and what is trauma? Have we improved behavioral change? And this one, I actually would love to be able to have Ken and I just spend a moment on talking about what is behavioral change to us. And I'll stop my share for a minute because I think that will help us to be able to see each other a little bit better. But what is behavioral change? And I think for us, Ken, as we think about this specifically, and Terry and Megan, you can jump in, but when I hear a teacher say to us through our stories on the Protect platform, I didn't think about asking my student what might have happened to them. I would say, what's wrong with you? Normally, I'd say, what's wrong with you? That's the sentence. But after going through the Protect training, I realized it's what's happened, right? It's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. So it's just making that trauma-informed change. Teachers will talk about that, and that in and of itself is behavior change, right? So they are changing their behavior and the language that they use to make it so that students feel they can come to a trusted adult. That's just one example of stories that we've heard. And I know, another is where teachers have open conversations with their students when they come in and look in their eyes, when they enter the classroom, to be able to say, okay, I'm here. I am that trusted adult. And we talk about that in the Protect program. How can you be that trusted adult? What are some of the actions you can take? Yeah. So I don't know, those are just some of the things I was thinking, Ken, off the top of my head, when we talk about behavioral change, what we want to see. You might want to share some too, or Megan or Terry too. But
Well, I think that what I love about Megan's story is what you and I actually had envisioned when we put this program together, was that these students would get this education and they would continue their educational career and hopefully go into careers where they're giving back. And to have, Megan doing this work in her profession, her new profession of nursing now, is exactly what I had hoped we would see. And so this type of education is a short-term solution because it's giving information to educators and young people to protect them, but it's also a long-term solution, because if we're going to get ahead in this fight against human trafficking, we've got to lift up a whole generation of freedom fighters in the spirit of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had a great quote. It's my favorite quote of his. He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And building strong children who are going to be advocates and educated and go out and educate their peers and their coworkers. Also behavioral changes with what the students are learning, and how they become educators and modern day abolitionists in this process. And they take this information home and they educate their siblings and they educate their parents and their grandparents. And so the impact of this education, just by one teacher teaching it in the classroom, and then that ripple effect throughout the students and the students taking it forward, is I think something that can have great impact as we try and get ahead on this issue.
And one thing I would like to say to that was, I was the first, staff member on I'm in a high school staff of over 100 teachers. I was the first staff member to step up and volunteer to be trained. My district did a one-day training, and then to step forward and do the Protect training to be able to teach the Protect in my classes. And some of my colleagues were hesitant, and it's a hard subject, and they were really uncomfortable. And I said, if you will do the training, I will do the teaching. And it just took that to more than triple my efforts, because I had, over 200 students. But when I said to 2 and 3 other colleagues, if you do the training, I will do the teaching, they were more than willing. And then they sat through the teaching and they realized, oh, I can do this. This is doable. And the curriculum is laid out in such a, a thoughtful and articulated manner that it makes it so much more manageable and doable for any teacher.
I actually had the privilege of seeing Terry teach, actually. I went to San Diego and I got to see her, and it was so great because exactly what she said, she made it easy for her colleagues to be able to see that this is really easy to do, and that the curriculum is laid out in such a way that is not overwhelming, but she just jumped right in. And so, I was thinking, Ken, back to the days of Maggie saying you can't clone people, but I was thinking, well, I just wanted to go in and see, in those places. If we could clone Terry, we would. Yeah, so I'm so incredibly grateful to be able to have witnessed that. And I think the other piece too, we think about the curriculum, we have the 5 to 10, and then 11 to 13, 14 to 18, and 16 to 18. And the last piece is really about bringing Frederick Douglass's story to life in creating modern day abolitionists within our youth that are older, who can say, I want to do a service project. I want to make sure that in my community that my community is protected. And so that might look like serving at a homeless shelter and looking for vulnerable populations. It might look like, working with a club to make sure that all students on campus understand what human trafficking is. It could look like one of our schools had a mock trial, human trafficking, where the entire school participated after being trained with the Protect program. And so the service project in our last module, which is for those 16 to 18-year-olds, too, just rounds out the journey to protect. And really helps those students launch into that place of becoming modern day abolitionists.
Over the years, some of the things that I've seen students do with their service projects in the community, we've had students that have trained first responders on how to recognize incidents of human trafficking, students that have presented at the UN. Really, we want students to use their passion, their talent, their creativity, and their intellect to figure out how they can address this issue. So students that love to write, we've seen them contact local papers and write op-eds. They've invited news stations to come out and do stories on the projects that they're doing. And, we have found over the years that the students and the teachers and the parents come up with these creative service projects greater than anything that we could ever think of. And it's just always so heartwarming to see what these teachers and students are able to do in their communities once they've received this education.
Yeah, absolutely. And we would love nothing more than to have Protect in Ireland. And so all of you who are watching, if that is something that you would like to, I think the last slide, which I won't bring up because it will shuffle back and forth, but it's really the next steps. We want to make sure that you can email us. Actually, maybe I will, because that'll make it so that you could do a screenshot if you wanted to. You can always email me. I actually think I have my email address here. And that way I can get you connected to the Protect program and one of our regional directors, but you can go ahead and screenshot that. And I think it's also important to talk about it. An educated community is a protected community. And we talk about that all the time with those who we're working with in the field, as well as our students, that when you're protected, then those around you are protected. And that's what we actually are on this journey for, is to make sure that happens. And so anyway, so that is email where you can ask. I know that we actually have a question that has come in. So I'm going to start to move towards questions. And if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to ask. And then I will also open it up that if there's anything we missed, Terry, Megan, or Ken, that we can talk about that too, because I know we have about 10 or 15 minutes that we allowed for questions. So this is the question. It says, what a brilliant initiative. Well done. Thank you. How, if at all, has Protect been affected by the QAnon conspiracy theory that's popular in the US at the moment? And let's answer that first. And then I can and I guess the comment is many people are jumping on the Save Our Children bandwagon, and many well-meaning individuals are misinformed about the facts of human trafficking. What is the best way to navigate false and misleading information about a legitimately serious topic? That is a fabulous question for whomever asked that question. And I think, Ken, you and I can both speak to that. Not here in the United States, those of us who've been in this movement for a long time put together a letter called the Freedom is Truth letter that both Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives as well as Three Strands Global Foundation were a part of. And it was exactly to combat the QAnon conspiracy theory of Save the Children. It was really putting out truth and facts versus fiction. And I think that we need to, as I started with in the conversation around what is human trafficking and what it is not, Ken and I believe strongly, and he can speak to it himself, but from my perspective, we cannot sensationalize this. This is not about sensationalizing this crime. This is about telling the real story of human trafficking, there are stories behind each individual. And when we make it a take and grab crime, that is not what it is. And so it is really important for us to know the truth and speak the truth, because the truth matters. So that would be my answer.
The truth definitely does matter. Of course, when we first started doing this work, it was really difficult because there was a movie out called Taken that a lot of people are familiar with. And that kind of created the narrative of what human trafficking is. And it was a movie. It was not something that was really based on fact. And so when you have to counteract this misinformation that's out there, it makes the job more difficult to do. But a program like Protect is important because we can funnel this information directly into schools and into classrooms, and educators are passionate about making sure their kids are learning and being taken care of. And so to be able to give them information that's going to help them be able to teach about this issue is really important. And I think that's why a program like Protect, because it's so comprehensive, there are a lot of organizations that are doing very good work and going into schools and doing awareness campaigns, maybe go in and do a 2-hour campaign, which is good because you're doing something. But if you're not prepared to know how to respond, if there is a disclosure in the classroom, if a child has the courage to say that they're in trouble or somebody else they know is in trouble, and there are no protocols in place for responding, then that student could be in a worse position. So the protocols, the first part of our program, is very important because we need to make sure that all of the stakeholders in the community that need to respond provide that safety net so that our kids are protected.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Any other questions that might come in, I will navigate. But Megan and Terry, I would love for you guys, when it comes to Megan, thinking about a trusted adult, because that is something that we talk about a lot in the Protect program. And, that a trusted adult could be your teacher, but it could have been anybody else on campus that was an adult too. Did you, after going through when your teacher was, teaching, was that clear to you that the trusted adult, that there were many people that you could go to?
Yeah, definitely. I think that that definitely was in the curriculum. And I think for me, a lot of the anti-human trafficking work that I did was through my church. And so a lot of those connections that I made were through that. And I feel like that's definitely where I felt maybe my trusted adult kind of lied, but absolutely. And that's so important. And I think, for me, I have a very supportive family and a mom who is educated about human trafficking, but not everybody does. And so that becomes even more important for those who don't have that support system or maybe don't have those role models. So definitely.
Yeah. Terry, what about you? I think, Ken talked about that the protocol piece, and I know San Diego actually is seen as the gem when it comes to protocols, because Protect has, we've authored over in California alone, I think 48 different protocols in the 58 counties that are in California, and obviously in Texas and Utah and Michigan, on our way in Georgia as well. But But I know that San Diego's protocol was one that we came in to be able to look at after it was established, and then there's been some revisions, but it is really seen as the protocol to follow. Any thoughts kind of around that, and how you feel empowered with that protocol?
Yeah, it's really it's a useful piece of information to share with, not just with my students, but with the adults on campus as to why we're doing this. It's in terms of a protocol, it's almost the same as like, well, we're mandating testing, or we're mandating this piece of curriculum be taught. It is in place. It's there to protect, and to serve our students. And so yeah, I wanted to also just kind of touch back on what Megan said about, a safe adult on campus. And that was one thing that I really tried towards the end of, teaching each time, is to put some good visuals in kids' heads of in their minds of what is, a trusted adult. And like on a high school campus, students have, 6 teachers in a day, but we also have a school nurse, we have school security, we have an SRO, which is a school police officer. And then I do tell them, you may have other places in your life where you have that, that trusted adult. And then just also offering, if you don't feel like you have that trusted adult, I am a trustworthy adult. Your story is safe with me. Your words are safe with me. Even if you are not my student, I will be your trusted adult, and just letting students know that you're there.
Yeah, and I think that that's so key. You're so right that, being deliberate, I am that trusted adult that you can come to is paramount. One of the questions that came into the chat was around taking Protect, thinking about prevention as it relates to Ireland, and how, Ken, did we in the very beginning, not only come together, but how are we doing, expansion to other countries, and how do we start? And so I thought maybe we could share, when we go to another country, we have a couple different ways that happens. That either happens from a nonprofit on the ground that approaches us and wants very much to bring Protect to that country in the educational system or other, whether that's law enforcement or social services. Or we actually have someone that we know that's an educator or a principal or superintendent or headmaster that comes to us and says, I want this to be here in my school or on my campus, my international school, whatever that might be. So those are some of the ways, the pathways to actually engage with us. Once we have those connections, we pull together a community, right? We've talked about the community and a protected community a lot. And so that means having our Protect representative, but it also means social services, the education community, the stakeholders, right? It may be legislators, it may be county or civic leaders, survivor leaders for sure in the community. All of those people are who we bring together to establish how will we roll Protect out. How will this look? What will this look like? And how do we make sure that it's localized so that it is appropriate for the Irish community in this place? Anything else, Ken, that I missed?
Yeah, I would say that it's important, your point about it being localized, there's not a one size that fits all. And while this is online training and there's a framework and a platform, a growth platform that it's built upon, each place is different. So it's important that whomever reaches out to us to bring this to their community, that we do have conversations with all of the stakeholders in the community, including law enforcement as well, because they're a part of this, a piece of this as well for the response. So, going into a community and assessing what's being done already. In some places that we go, there are organizations that have been on the ground for years doing very important work. And then there are other places that we go where there's less work being done. So we have to make sure that we're not coming in and just saying, this is Protect and we're going to save your community, but collaborate and work together. And Ashlie, if you could talk a little bit about the legislative piece, because I think it's important because it goes hand in hand and what you've been able to do in California. And then I can talk about the federal legislation that we were able to work on and pass.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. Thanks for that. So in California, we passed AB 1227, which is the Human Trafficking Prevention Education Act, which mandates training in the state of California for all teachers, as well as education at least once in high school and once in middle school. And then we also passed in Utah similar legislation, and that also is training and education for students. And what that did was it brought the framework together, and it's an unfunded mandate. We always want mandates to be funded. It happens to be unfunded, but what it does is it really sets the stage for accountability, not only for the educational staff and the counties, but also the state, right? That this is a priority, that we understand prevention really does change everything, and legislation really does that. It really sets the tone. So there aren't very many states that have that type of legislation in the United States, and even less globally, that is focused on mandating training and education. So that's something that we definitely want to do as we continue our work in the US and beyond.
I had mentioned in my opening remarks about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was legislation in 2020. And that really guides how the federal government in the United States responds to trafficking internationally and domestically. And it was really a piece of legislation that is reactionary only and not preventative at all. And so we were able to work with lawmakers on Capitol Hill to work on that reauthorization of that legislation and make prevention a priority. And so we're very honored that in the bicentennial year of Frederick Douglass, which was in 2018, we were able to get that renamed in his honor. It's the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. And just by adding prevention language to that legislation, we were able to start a conversation about the importance of primary prevention education. And then there was money that was appropriated in that legislation for the first time that goes directly to age-appropriate education in the classroom. And the funding that's in that legislation some of it is helping us to expand into other places.
Yeah, Ken, I'm so glad you said primary prevention. And that's something that for our listeners, I really hope that you hear from us, and that Ken talked about earlier, awareness is really important, but primary and secondary and tertiary prevention are also equally, if not more important. So PROTECT is really about primary and secondary prevention. It's about making sure that we go deeper, and that behavioral change component can happen holistically, because awareness, although really important too, is scratching the surface, and we want to make sure that we have the ability to help those who are trained to identify and actually respond. And then for our students to be able to know that they can go to a trusted adult. And so that gets us past that primary to secondary, which is the intervention space of prevention. So really important for us to strive to continue to be really well-rounded in that place. The last piece I thought I would talk about is the platform, because Ken, you talked about that. Partnering with Arizona State University has really changed our value proposition when it comes to PROTECT, because it is a growth platform. As we've talked about here today, it is not just about a learning management system. It's about how can we see our teachers and our students grow, and then sharing that with each other, which helps build communities of communication. It gives us a lot of qualitative data and stories. We have over 16,000 stories from those who have been trained just this year in 2020. And those qualitative stories are telling us not only about the training curriculum, but they're telling us about what they're seeing in their classroom, and what they're seeing with their students, or how they feel. I actually will share one story I remember reading lately, of a teacher who felt overwhelmed. Terry, kind of what your teachers and colleagues said to you. And I'm not sure I'll be able to do this. And it was so great, because within the PROTECT platform, we give other teachers and staff the ability to comment and share with each other. And we had a slew of teachers commenting after this teacher had been vulnerable in that place to say, I'm a little fearful, to be able to say, gosh, you know what, I was too, but I went through this training curriculum, and here's what I've done, and here's some things I actually did that are tangible. And that's what it's about, right? It's about creating protected communities. And so I really, I think that also points to the holistic nature of what we're doing, but also points very specifically to the PROTECT program.
Yeah, and I guess one final thought, since this is Douglass Week, to talk about Frederick Douglass as an abolitionist. And, obviously he worked hard to abolish slavery, the legalized state-sanctioned slavery that we had here in the United States. And people ask me all the time, what would Frederick Douglass do if he were here today? What would he say? And of course, nobody really knows, but because his blood flows through my veins, I'll take some liberty and I'll say that I know that he would still be fighting to end slavery. Slavery still exists all over the world. We call it human trafficking, but it is modern day slavery, because if you look at historical slavery and you look at contemporary forms of slavery, if you boil down those basic elements, they're both about exploiting the most vulnerable among us for money and for profit. And so if he were here today, he would still be in this fight, and he would still be speaking out, speaking truth to power as he did. And, there was a story near the end of his life. He spent the last 17 years of his life in a home in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C., on a big hill called Cedar Hill. And he used to love to interact in the neighborhood with the children, and he played baseball with the children in the neighborhood. And there was a boy that came up to him one time and said, "Mr. Douglass, what advice would you give to a young man who's interested in fighting for equality and fighting against injustice?" And without hesitation, the great abolitionist said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." And that's what he did. He made people feel uncomfortable. He spoke truth to power. He pushed for change. And so, being his descendant, this is work that still continues today. And I'm very honored to have our organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, partner with Three Strands Global Foundation and Love Never Fails on this very important project.
Yeah. Oh, that was great. Ken, thank you so much. And if any closing thoughts, Terry or Megan too, because that was a drop the mic moment. So, but if you guys have any thoughts or feelings, we'd love to hear them. And as we close this out in our last few minutes.
It's been an honor to participate and to be able to share and to continue doing the work that needs to be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Absolutely. I second that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And thank you, Ken, for always being such a dear friend and colleague in this fight. And I'm so appreciative of you and our collaboration, and so grateful, because in the space of nonprofits, it doesn't happen very often. And I'm truly grateful for our work together in this space.
Yeah, I am as well. And it is an example, our collaboration, of how we can work together and how organizations can work together, and we don't need to work in separate silos. In the nonprofit world, funding is always a challenge. And so I think people tend to go into their corners and try and do this work alone. But we found through Protect and our collaboration that we can have a greater impact. So hopefully this will inspire all of you out there that are doing this work already or want to get involved and to collaborate with people in your community. And for more information on what we're doing, you can go to the Protect website, which is protectnow.org. And you'll be able to get information there and be able to contact us directly. So thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening. Thank you for tuning in, and I wish you the best for the rest of the evening. Good night.
Thanks
everybody.
I just wanted to say a quick thank you from the team here at Douglass Week to everybody for participating. This has been a fantastic conversation, and as I say, particularly grateful to you, Terry and Megan, for your perspectives and as on the ground warriors for change and education. It's such an important part of this topic and ongoing work. And I should say on that note, the work of Douglass Week continues. Douglass Week, as many of you may know, was originally conceived as a day, became a week, and now we've decided that this will be the first Douglass Week of many. So we look forward as an organization, Douglass Week, to working with groups like yours, like Three Strands, FDFI, school groups and student groups on this topic of human trafficking prevention, education, and hope there's a lot of good work to come with you all and others in the future. So thanks very much for your comments and participating today. And just a quick additional programming note, it is Douglass Week again, so today is day 2. We have more this week. We have more tonight with a presentation on depictions of Frederick Douglass on stage and screen, and Ken will be participating in that conversation. Thank you, Ken. We have author talks and poetry talks and a musical evening tomorrow night, and we will end our programming on Sunday, Valentine's Day, with a really special group of strong women leaders, including Nettie Washington Douglas and former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, about the leadership and women's roles across different genres. And so we hope you all go to douglasandcork.com and join us for these and other programming coming up. So thank you very much to everyone for attending, and thanks again for participants.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thanks.
And
Thank you,
February
Kristen.
14th is also Frederick Douglass's birthday,
Thank
too.
you. Yes.
Oh,
Thank you.
yay.
Thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.